فكلي واشربي وقري عينا فإما ترين من البشر أحدا فقولي إني نذرت للرحمن صوما.
Hey everyone, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the Islamic Mary podcast. So today we've reached to verse 18 in the chapter of Mary or Maryam. And this is the point of the story that, as we discussed in the past, that Maryam is now in a state where this angel appears to her. And this angel appears to her as a human being, as a man. And in this verse, she exclaims and she talks about her own fears about this man appearing out of nowhere. As we recall, she's now in a state of seclusion. She's away from her family. She is contemplating in a state of worship. And all of a sudden, this man appears and she has mixed feelings and questions about his intentions. So it says in translation, she said, "I seek the Lord of mercy's protection against you. If you have any fear of him, do not approach." So she says in this verse, قَالَتْ إِنِّي أَعُوذُ بِالرَّحْمَنِ مِنْكَ إِن كُنْتَ تَقِيًّا. So she says, I seek refuge. And this is a common phrase in the Islamic tradition, أَعُوذُ بِاللَّهِ, I seek refuge in God. Also, there's a common phrase that says, أَعُوذُ بِاللَّهِ مِنَ الشَّيْطَانِ الرَّجِيمِ, I seek refuge from the accursed Satan. And she's afraid at this point. And she says, I'm seeking refuge bir-Rahman. And this is another beautiful aspect of this chapter, is a constant emphasis of mercy. So we see that mercy is mentioned in the beginning when it talks about Zachariah. It talks about how he has this passionate plea and that he's going to the Lord of mercy for a child. We also see that Maryam is seeking refuge in the Lord of mercy, minka, from you. So she doesn't recognize that this is an angel, that this is the angel of Gabriel, Jibreel, in kunta taqiyya. And if you are truly have piety. And when I first read this verse, you can see here that Maryam is in the state of awe, right, in shock. She doesn't know who this person is. And why is she afraid, right? That's a question that emerges. And this brings to a larger question of women's issues. So many times when we are looking at biblical figures, we're often looking at men. We're looking at Moses, Musa, or Ibrahim. And while they do have fear, and that fear is talked about in the Quran, they may not have that same level of fear as a woman who is approached in a secluded situation. And this is something that even today, many of my female students, female colleagues, they mentioned to me that they wouldn't go out by themselves at night. Or if they're going by themselves, so make sure that they have some type of companion. So this verse in many ways opens up these questions of the relationship between genders, male and female, and how women feel when they're alone and in sacred spaces. And we see that this verse is connected to other verses in the Quran that talk about angels and talk about angels coming and approaching prophetic figures. So we see in this chapter, the chapter of Maryam, how Maryam is compared to Ibrahim. And Abraham has this encounter with angels himself. So if we look at different parts in the Quran, there is this idea of Ibrahim as being the host. So we have this idea in Surat Hud, for instance, that Ibrahim is approached by God's messenger, Rasuluna, and he's given a glad tidings. And these angels, they come and they say, Qadu salama. They say, peace be upon you, which is reminiscent of Muslim greetings of Assalamu alaikum, also of other greetings such as Shalom. And then he responds and he says, Qada salam. So we see a key difference here. And that initially these angels, they come to Ibrahim and they say salam, and Ibrahim responds and he says salam back. So he's not initially afraid, as we see with Maryam. That Maryam is seeking refuge in the Lord of mercy from this being. And then he sees them as guests. And as guests, he says peace to them, and then he roasts a calf for them and hosts them within his house. But when he saw that their hands did not reach the food, he became suspicious and fearful of them. So in the Quranic story, the angels come, he begins to host them, but these angels don't start eating the food. And you can imagine if someone put a big plate of food in front of you or in front of travelers on a long journey, they would immediately start eating. But these beings did not approach, they did not put their hands close to the food and began to eat. So it says in the Quran, وَأَوْجَسَ مِنْهُمْ خِيفَةً, that all of a sudden he became suspicious and fearful. And the word of fear is actually used, of khawf, khifa. And the angels, they saw this. They saw that Ibrahim was uncomfortable, that he started to be afraid. And they respond to him and they say, قَالُوا لَا تَخَفْ, don't be afraid. Right? So this is a fascinating dialogue between the angels and Ibrahim, that initially he doesn't recognize them. He begins to host them. But when he feels that there's something wrong, that this doesn't feel right, he begins to feel fear within himself. But then the angels try to comfort him. And they say, we've been sent on this journey to the people of Lot. So it mentions here then, the story continues, that فَبَشَّرْنَاهَا بِإِسْحَاقَ, then we gave the good news of Ishaq, or Isaac. And after Isaac will be that of Jacob. So what's interesting here is that when these angels, they come for a particular purpose. They came to tell Ibrahim, and Sarah or Sarah the idea that they're going to have a child. And that child is going to have a specific name. That name is Isaac, Ishaq. And then they're going to the people of Lot. And here, Sarah, in a similar way as we'll see with Maryam, she has this objection. And she says, قَالَتْ يَا وَيْلَتَنَا أَلِدُ وَأَنَا عَجُوزٌ وَهَذَا بَعْلِي شَيْخًا. So she says in this interesting phrase that when she hears from the angels that she's going to have this child, she says, how can I have this child in old age? And my husband here is an old man. He's a sheikh. And this is something, إِنَّ هَذَا لَشَيْءٌ عَجِيبٌ, this is something that's weird or astonishing, that this can truly happen. And here many of the medieval scholars make this comparison between Maryam and Sarah, or Mary and Sarah, that initially when the angel comes and informs them that they're going to have a child, they are immediately skeptical. They're like, we see with Maryam in a couple of verses that she'll say, hey, this doesn't make sense. No man has ever touched me before. Now, for Sarah, she is saying, well, how could this happen? I'm an old woman. I'm no longer in my prime years. My husband is also older. This is something that, older people do not normally have children. This is something astonishing. This is something that's odd. And then the angels respond and they say, قَالُوا أَتَعْجَبِينَ مِنْ أَمْرِ اللَّهِ. And then they ask her directly, are you astonished or you find it odd the command of God? وَرَحْمَةُ اللَّهِ وَبَرَكَاتُهُ عَلَيْكُمْ أَهْلَ الْبَيْتِ إِنَّهُ حَمِيدٌ مَجِيدٌ. So here the angels say that this is a mercy from God and a blessing upon you to the people of this house. Verily God is praiseworthy and glorious. They respond to Sarah and they say, are you really astonished with the command of God? So she was initially skeptical. How can this happen? But they remind her that this is a command from God, that this isn't simply something that the angels themselves are informing her will happen. Rather, that this is something that God is decreed. And we'll see something similar with that of Maryam. And they mention and they continue saying this is not simply a command from God, but this is a mercy. So once again, we see this idea of children being a mercy and a blessing upon this house. And that verily God is Hamidun Majid, that verily he is someone who is praiseworthy and all glorious. That part of his miracle is, in the case of Maryam, that she has a child as a virgin. And here, in the case of Ibrahim and Sarah, that they have a child even though they are older. So we also see that the commentators, especially someone like Ibn Hazm in the medieval time, he talks about this one verb, ata'jabina. And if you look closely into the Arabic, the angels are speaking directly to Sarah. They're saying, are you have this astonishment in the command of God. So the Quran many times encompasses, it quotes different biblical and Quranic figures. And here it quotes this saying from Sarah herself, that she is an astonished, how can I have a child when my husband is an old man and I am old as well? And she says, this is weird, right? This is astonishing. And the angels, they respond to her and they say, you shouldn't be astonished in the command of God. The God has this decree and he's going to bring mercy and blessings upon you. So the idea here is that the angels are speaking directly to Sarah. And just as we'll see that the angel Jibril in the chapter of Maryam speaks directly to Maryam. So this brings up a larger theological debate of the idea of female prophecy. So for people like Ibn Hazm, that it was important that anyone who had direct communication with God, whether that be a dream, whether hearing the divine voice, or whether it be angels, and they were spoken directly to, that person was a prophet. So he would characterize Maryam as a Nabiya, as a prophet, and he would also characterize Sarah as a prophet as well, because the angels come and they don't only speak to Abraham, they don't only speak to Ibrahim, but they also speak directly to Sarah, and they speak to her concerns, her question, how could this happen, in a similar way with Maryam. And we also see that Ibn Hazm will look at the story of Moses, of Musa. So the mother of Musa, who is Jochebed in the biblical tradition, that she has this dream, وَأَوْحَيْنَا إِلَى أُمِّ مُوسَى, that verily we had this revelation to the mother of Moses. And this idea that she should throw her child literally into the Nile, put him in a cradle, and let him float away. So for Ibn Hazm, this idea of wahi, of revelation, could happen to men and to women. And if it happened to women, then they would be on the same level of male prophets as well. Some scholars today that argue that this is a type of proto-feminism. And you can argue that if you read closely the Quranic verses, you see that the divine messengers, the divine voice is speaking directly to women, and that male scholars, even in the medieval period, understood this and saw this, and they tried to form this type of equality. However, I think this is less to do with gender equality rather than being fair about the linguistic text. So for Ibn Hazm, he wasn't necessarily throughout his writings trying to argue that men and women are equal in the same way that maybe modern feminists would do today. Rather, he was someone who was a textual scholar, and he looked closely at text. And he was someone that didn't believe that the fiqh or the Islamic law or the theological tradition should supersede what the actual and literal text said. So as someone who was a Zahiri or as a literalist, he looked at these verses and he said, wow, there's something unique here. There's something interesting going on that other scholars who have developed these theological schemes may have overlooked. And for a lot of scholars, they just took it for granted that males are prophets and prophethood is exclusive to males. But if you look at the Quranic text, you do see these examples of divine revelation, whether that be wahi or a dream or a direct communication like this between angels and women. And that leads to the larger debate of what does that mean? Does it mean that these women are these women prophets, just like male prophets? Are they in a special category of select women? Or are they people who are divinely chosen, but not necessarily that prophets? Maybe they are saints, awliya, or maybe they are people who affirm the message of God, siddiqa, for instance. So this leads to a larger debate of what the role of women is in Islam, and also the role of women in the Quranic text. So to conclude, we see that verse 18 begins this interaction with Maryam and Jibril. And this interaction is initially that of fear, that Maryam doesn't recognize Jibril. She sees a man and she's afraid. And this fear is similar to how other figures such as Abraham interacted with angels. That Ibrahim, for instance, when he first hosts The angels, he doesn't have this state of fear. They come in a state of humanity as human beings. And this may be a difference between men and women and sacred spaces, that they may occupy the same space, but they feel differently in those spaces based on their gender. That a woman, for instance, going into a mosque may feel different than how a man would. And here she has the angel come to her and she is afraid. In a similar way, when Ibrahim sees that the angels are not eating from the food that he has cooked, he also begins to feel uncomfortable, and they try to comfort him. And they mention to him that he will have Isaac as a child. Now, this will eventually lead to a dialogue between the angels and that of Sarah. And this dialogue is crucial because it shows this questioning, this idea of divine questioning. And many of the Qur'anic and biblical figures, they don't immediately accept the divine command. They have a question about it. Maryam, she says, hey, how could this happen? I'm a virgin. Where Sarah, she says, well, I'm old and my husband is old as well. And eventually the angels will say that this is a divine decree and something that you will have to accept, and that this is a mercy from God and part of his blessing. He is someone who is praiseworthy and glorious. And we see that this direct communication with women was not something that medieval and classical scholars overlooked. We see Quranic commentary focusing on women as something of the modern period, something that modern feminists or female scholars do. However, we see that even medieval scholars saw that there was this direct communication between the divine messengers and women, and then they debated this. What does this communication mean? Does it mean that they're prophets? Are they the best of women? Are they of people who should be given special names like Siddiqa, the one who affirms the revelation? And this leads to another larger question of the role of women in the Quranic text, and also that of communication with the divine. Thanks once again for listening to the Islamic Mary podcast. I would encourage you to subscribe to this podcast. If you haven't already, encourage your friends, students, and colleagues to do so as well. Always feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions, if you have any ideas, suggestions for future episodes. You're welcome to review this podcast. It helps other people find the podcast. And of course, you can visit my website and my newsletter, where you'll be updated on the forthcoming publication of my book, The Islamic Mary. And I started the Islamic Mary quiz. I see that many of you have already taken. You can see that in the show notes. Test your knowledge of Maryam, what you know about her, what you don't know about her. And the answers to all those questions are going to be in my forthcoming book. Thanks once again, and take care.